The use of distillers' grains in cattle diets by Francis Fluharty for the February 23rd, 2012 Beef Feedlot program in Mansfield.
You ready?
Yep.
Okay, we're going to discuss use of distillers' grains in beef cattle diets. And I think we all know, if we look at the last 5 or 6 years, as the red graph up here shows, it shows the increasing use of corn for ethanol and what this means. And so I think the importance of this, when we look at this, and this chart is a few years old now, but it does a good job of signifying what's really happening. And what's really happening is we have more ethanol produced in corn growing states, which makes sense. Some of the things we're dealing with as a result of this are the things you're dealing with every day. Your corn basis is going up. More of what you can afford to feed economically are co-products, primarily distillers' grains or syrup, or in some cases corn gluten feed, but it's all centering here in the Midwest. And one of the things that we've got to keep in mind when we fit distillers' grains into diets, for some of you, it's not only the animal use. It is the amount of nitrogen at high levels of distillers' grains that's going into the manure. And so that has huge implications from whole farm nutrient management plan status. But one of the real areas of growth with manure experts is valuing that manure differently from livestock that are on high levels of distillers' grains, because there's so much nitrogen and so much phosphorus in it. And so for some of you, when you start looking at going to higher levels, the thing I'm going to suggest that you get with are your agronomists and your manure management experts to look at valuing that manure differently and figuring out what the real nitrogen and phosphorus content of it is. So let's just run through a corn grain and just explain that when we make distillers' grains, what we're doing is we're fermenting the starch to make ethanol. So what we're left with is the bran and the endosperm and the germ. So what we have left are really the parts of the corn kernel where the oil and the protein and the fiber is contained. And we're going to go into this a lot over the course of the next hour and a half. Now, when we look at distillers' grains production, and this is a dry mill process, and what that dry mill really means is that you start with whole corn and it's hammer milled dry. At that point in time, it's put into a slurry tank. It goes through steam with the jet cooler. It undergoes liquefaction, and then it goes over into the fermentation tanks. A lot of the issues that we have with distillers' grains occurs at this end, because the enzymes that have been developed for fermentation of ethanol are very specific from yeasts. And one of the things that you have to control in an ethanol plant is any bacterial growth that could occur that will divert starch away from ethanol production. So quite frankly, a lot of sulfuric acid is used in distillers' grains, or actually in ethanol production, and that varies by plant to plant. So I'm going to say this right up front. Distillers' grains is one of the most variable products that we have ever fed. And if you are purchasing distillers' grains from one plant consistently, expect those to be different from distillers' grains at any other plant, because the 4 or 5 types of technology that are used that are specific to different companies who build these plants will result in differences in the distillers' grains. Also, because corn differs from year to year and field to field, there will be batches of this fermentation that have to be dumped because not enough ethanol is being produced. And in cleaning up for those fermentation tanks, they use sulfuric acid to kill the bacteria that are present there. For that reason, because anything that's dumped goes into the co-product, because these are energy plants. These aren't plants trying to make distillers' grains. These are plants trying to make ethanol. You have to realize that it's the plant ethanol production that comes first, and you have to be willing to deal with variability in the product. So, just real quickly, if we have a dry mill plant, what we end up is ethanol and distillers grains. Now, I have in this study, they could be dry grains, but we'll discuss all the different types of wet distillers that are basically dependent on the moisture content. On the other hand, if we have a wet mill plant, like the corn fructose plant that Cargill has down near Dayton, whenever you have a wet mill plant, you don't end up with the distillers grains. You end up with corn gluten feed. You also, at that point in time, these are the plants where we get our corn sweeteners from. Now, a lot of people have asked over the years if they can get distillers grains from a bourbon plant or any of those other types of liquor plants from the distillers grains. Are those of a different quality than distillers grains that are coming from an ethanol plant? In general, I would say yes. And the reason I would say yes in general is because we don't want sulfur compounds in any of the products that we consume, because the characteristic flavor and odor of rotten eggs comes from sulfur compounds. So if you are purchasing distillers grains that come from a whiskey plant, they're going to inherently not use as much sulfuric acid as is used in an ethanol plant. Any acids would work for cleaning up the fermentation, but sulfuric is the most economical. So that would be the big difference. You don't have as much variability in sulfur. Other than that, the processes are largely the same. So if I look at distillers grains, I basically have three types, and it's based upon moisture content. Wet distillers grains that are going to run around 35% dry matter, modified distillers grains at around 45%, and dried distillers grains at around 90%. We're also going to end up with syrup and distillers solubles and a lot of other products that people are using. Now, I'm going to caution you on one thing. If you get a contract for a bunch of these other solubles and you're going to supplement with that, have an analysis done on those for sulfur. I know people that are taking tank loads of syrup and solubles further west. There is a variation in the sulfur compounds of those too. So if you can get an idea of the range of those products, if you end up using them, that's just a good idea. Okay, so here are some of the other differences. Let's look at corn gluten feed really differently, because a lot of you that have feedlots might also be backgrounding calves. And if you are backgrounding calves on a high forage diet, I'm going to suggest that maybe you want to look at corn gluten feed. And the reason that I suggest you look at corn gluten feed, if you're backgrounding calves, or if you have a grower yard where you're using a bunch of haylage or silage, anything that's a forage-based feed, or chopped hay, anything that's a forage, the biggest limiting factor to forage digestibility in most cases is ruminally available nitrogen, rumen ammonia. Corn gluten feed has about 80% of its corn protein or its crude protein available in the rumen. That's a huge amount of ruminally available protein. It really is a benefit with forage-based diets. Corn gluten feed doesn't have nearly the oil content of distillers grains. So its estimated energy value is only about 1 to 15% greater than corn. It's more fiber, less protein, less oil. We look at distillers grains then, and estimated energy value we're going to talk about, depending on who you listen to, can be anywhere from 15 to 40% greater than corn. There's a lot of variation out there, and it has a lot to do with what you're feeding it with. But you have to remember that it's high fat, but the big thing with distillers grains is that about 65% of the crude protein from distillers grains is really a bypass protein, which means it doesn't break apart in the rumen, and that ammonia, that nitrogen from the protein is not available to the rumen bacteria. We'll talk about some issues with that at low levels of dietary inclusion here in a minute. Okay, as I mentioned, we also have distiller solubles. Sometimes this is also called syrup. It's about 26% protein. It's higher fat. It's normally going to run, I mean, there's some variation here, about 35 to 60%, 65% dry matter. I'm not really going to deal any with the syrup tonight or the corn gluten feed. I'm going to take the rest of this talk really and talk about distillers grains. I just want you to be aware of the other products that are out there. Okay, so if I were to compare feeds, WDG is wet distillers grains, DDGs is dried distillers grains and solubles. So if I were to compare them to corn, corn's going to run around 8.5 to 9% crude protein. Dried distillers grains, which is what we're feeding here in Ohio, is going to run about 30. The fat content's going to move from about 3.2% up to about 10 to 13%. But our two problem areas that we have with distillers grains really are the percent phos. From 0.35% in corn, we move up to 0.83% phosphorus with distillers grains. So I'm going to tell you this next thing a couple of times. If you have a feedlot and you are feeding distillers grains, do not have any have any phosphorus in your mineral supplement. Phosphorus in your mineral supplement with distillers grains in the diet, you run a lot higher chance of urinary calculi or water belly. The animal does not need anywhere near that. Also, phosphorus is one of the most expensive things that goes into a mineral. So if you're buying a loose mineral and mixing it in, it will actually save you money not to have phosphorus in that feedlot mineral. The thing we're going to focus a lot on is sulfur. Corn has about 0.14% sulfur. Distillers grains can have anywhere, realistically, I've seen them as low as 0.4. I've seen samples as high as 1.7. Routinely, we're going to be somewhere between about 0.5 and 1.2, maybe 1.4 on the high end. But that's a huge amount of variation. And one of the things I want you just to write down and keep in mind, the NRC, or Nutrient Requirements Council, sets the maximum tolerable limit for sulfur at 0.4% of the diet dry matter. So what you can see, knowing that, is that if you're using high levels of distillers grains inclusion, and let's say you've got distillers grains that are 1% phosphorus, you can easily go over that 0.4%. And it's that sulfur that's caused a lot of the problems that we've seen with distillers grains. So, if I look, I'm just going to show you some estimated feeding values from a variety of places. And I'm just going to focus on the dried distillers grains because that's what we're feeding here in Ohio. So, as you move up percent of diet dry matter with distillers grains, you actually see that it has a higher feeding value relative to corn. And that's because as you feed more, you get more oil into the diet of these cattle. Well, oil is 2.25 times more energy dense per unit of weight than protein or carbohydrates. So the more oil I add, the more energy I get out of that diet. And we're going to discuss the limits. Before we move on, I want to clear up one thing though, because this has gotten a lot of play here in Ohio over the last, I'd say, few months. I hear a lot of people talking about new generation distillers grains. The reality of it is, if your distillers grains look anything like this, a golden color at all, they are new generation distillers grains. The older generation distillers grains come from a lot of the plants that were put up in the 90s and the early 2000s, a lot of farmer cooperator plants that were going up in the Midwest put up plants where the distillers grains came out much darker, almost brown in color. Now, we're confusing the majority of distillers grains that we have now. They are new generation. The difference is in the drying of these distillers grains. That's one of the main differences. And here's just a general thing for you to keep in mind. If you look at this picture, those distillers grains are a nice golden color. That is the color that they come out when you don't dry them harshly. when you get really dark distillers grains, because the dryers are set at either a higher temperature, and usually they're dried for a shorter period of time at a higher temperature, the darker you get, the more unavailable the protein and the energy from those distillers grains are, because they go through what's called the browning reaction. They turn brown. It's technically called the Maillard reaction, but it's the binding of the lysine that's in the protein with the carbohydrate that's left in the distillers grains, and it makes them both unavailable. It ties up the protein. So the reason I put that is there's a whole market out here in the feed industry for heat-damaged proteins, and there are brokers that sell heat-damaged distillers grains. So here's what I'm going to suggest to you. If you get a great, quote, buy on distillers grains, when everyone else is paying $200 a ton, and you get a call for some distillers grains that are $100 a ton, you can do an availability, a protein availability. Don't buy it until you know that, because it may pass right on through the animal. Might be available out in the field as manure, but it's probably going to pass right through the animal. You just have to be aware of that. Now, having said that, these newer generation are what's going to be in this 10 to 13% fat, around 30% crude protein, and this 0.5 to 1.4% sulfur. Okay, that's new generation. I don't want you to get confused with new generation distillers grains, which is what we have in Ohio in all these newer plants, with low-fat distillers grains, because this is the latest thing that come down the pike, and Poet just announced this Dakota Gold low-fat distillers grains. Many of these companies are looking at ways of pulling the fat out of the distillers grains long before they go through the fermentation, because that corn oil has a higher value on the market as corn oil, and it also makes that fermentation in the vat much more efficient. The problem with having fat in that fermentation is that that fat coats the particles, and the ethanol yield is not as high as it would be if the fat's removed. These low-fat distillers grains are designed for dairy use. If you pull out this fat, what you're basically left with is a bypass protein and fiber. And if you can control the sulfur in there, you've got a very good feed for the dairy industry. So don't be confused by this. Okay? Now, what's this mean for the future? What it really means for the future is that we're really going to have to pay attention to the distillers grains that we're buying. Make sure you know what you're buying, especially if you are buying carloads of it or semi-loads of it. You'll be able to identify at this point in time the plants that they are coming from, because to retrofit these plants is very expensive. Okay, so I haven't heard of these being produced in Ohio yet. This plant in Wisconsin just came online. So I just wanted to clear that up before we go. So what I'm going to talk about now are the challenges and the implications of fat, nitrogen, and sulfur. So a lot of questions and a lot of research has been done on what's the optimum inclusion level for distillers grains. And we're going to hit this. This is a graph that shows, and this was done by Alfredo Di Costanzo at the University of Minnesota and Chris Reinhardt at Kansas State back in 2006. They looked at a meta-analysis of all of the studies that have been done to that point in time with distillers grains. And what they found is, and this is 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and this is the ether extractable fat level. And this is the co-product percentage. And what it shows is, as you add more fat to the diet, or more distillers grains to the diet, fat goes up linearly. Well, here's the reality of this. When you get to 6% fat that occurs at around 35 to 40% distillers grains, that is the maximum amount of fat that you can add to a forage-based diet before all that fat in the rumen coats the feed particles. And with forage digestion, the bacterial species that digest forages actually adhere to them, and it's a very tight adhesion. Okay, that fat coats the fiber particles, and they can't digest it as well. So if you're working in a backgrounding yard with distillers grains, regardless of the price, if they're this high-fat stuff, you want to be down somewhere in this 20% range. That's why, with the dairy industry being so big in Wisconsin, there's been a push to take this fat out of the distillers grains so we can use the distillers grains more for the protein and the fiber component. Now, in feedlots, especially in the summer, we don't need to worry about that 6% fat. We can go to 7 or 7.5% fat. And the reality of it is, when we get out into the area where we're looking at 60% distillers grains in some of these research diets, we're looking at fat levels that are around 7.5%. Those diets have a lot of energy because of all that fat in them. Okay, so just to reiterate, with a forage diet, I don't want my dietary fat above 4%. Really, for a safety factor, because 6% fat's my maximum, but with a grain-based diet, I'm comfortable with 6% fat in the total diet. Now, here's where this gets really interesting. Because that fat has so much energy, the blue is feed efficiency, and the red is average daily gain. Along the bottom is this level of diet inclusion, and it goes 0, 10, 20, 30, and 40, where it ends in these studies. If you look at average daily gain at 40%, you see that in the studies that were done, average daily gain is actually higher with cattle in feedlots at 40% distillers grains than when there's none there. It sort of peaked at about 20%. Okay? If we look at feed efficiency, up here, pounds of feed per pound of gain is almost 1 pound lower pound of feed per pound of gain at 40% than we're up here at 0 distillers grains. It actually doesn't show a lot of difference in efficiency between about 20 and 40%. So if I were just to look at this, I would say that if corn is high and if distillers grains are a good buy, my goal would be to feed more distillers grains. And actually, that's what we see in a lot of large feedlots. We see higher percentages of distillers grains being fed. Now, several of you have called me over the last few years and said, what level are you comfortable with me feeding? I will routinely tell you, if you're a farmer feeder, that I'm comfortable with you feeding 20 to 25%. I don't mean this to be insulting, but it's a reality. In a large feedlot where they are doing feed sampling constantly and where they are weighing feed every day, every load, and they have batch numbers and there are scales where they can really accurately deliver product, and where they are weighing cattle at reimplantation time and at other times along the way, they've got a better handle on how animals are performing than you do if you know the weight in and you don't know another weight until they go out. So the levels I have been comfortable with historically are totally related to how much management you have at those steps in between. And I'm really comfortable at 20 or 25% distillers grains. You'll see that I'm pretty comfortable at 30% distillers grains. When we start going higher, your management has to kick up to use them. And here's why. This chart just shows, based on book values, the nutrients in a diet that would have 25% distillers grains. And if you look down here, a diet with 60% corn, 25% distillers grains, 10% hay, and a supplement with some minerals and some other protein would have about 13.6% protein. You'd have about 4.6% fat, no problem. And you'd only have 0.32 to 0.39% sulfur. That's not going to get you in trouble. You're under that 0.4% sulfur. There's a couple other things that I want you to kind of pick up with this. If you're feeding 25% distillers grains or less, and you call me, I'm probably going to tell you that I would like to see you still have a half a pound of soybean meal in the diet, or some urea in the diet, because I want some ruminally available nitrogen, because on a high grain diet, you have to have nitrogen and protein. The way we determine percent protein in the lab is we take the percent nitrogen in a feed, multiply it by 6.25 to come up with the percent protein. So basically, protein is around 16% nitrogen. It's that nitrogen that turns into ammonia when it binds the hydrogen ions in the rumen that the rumen bacteria use to divide. So to get the most digestibility out of your feed, you have to have high levels of ruminally available nitrogen. Well, soybean meal on a grain-based diet is about 60% to 80% ruminally available nitrogen. Urea has 281% protein equivalents. It's all available as ammonia in the rumen. So at low levels of distillers grains, I'm going to tell you to do some of that. Because quite frankly, the protein that's in corn is about 60% rumen bypass. So even though this diet has 13.6% protein, the protein from corn and the protein from distillers grains are both going to be about 60% bypass. And ruminally available nitrogen may be an issue. Now this changes if we move up to a diet that's 50% distillers grains. And there are a lot of people in the U.S. now, a lot of commercial feed yards feeding 50% distillers grains. Well, here's the big kicker with this. My protein moves from that 13% up to 19% protein. When you're above 40% distillers grains in a diet, there's research out in Nebraska that shows you don't need urea, you don't need any more ruminally available nitrogen sources, because you're overloading them with so much protein that 40% of that protein being available in the rumen from that high of a level of inclusion of distillers grains is plenty of ruminally available nitrogen. If you're in that 40 to 50% protein range, though, you can see real quickly that your manure is going to be significantly different just because the diet is so much different, 19% protein. You're also then in that range of sulfur from 0.45 to 0.59. It's all above 0.4. So we have to be concerned about sulfur, because what we get is feedlot polio. We get a polioencephalomalacia, which I'll discuss a lot here tonight. Now, I want to show you how some of these things can be fine points. This is some real recent work that Amy Reduns did out of the University of Wisconsin. And there's going to be a theme that I'm going to tell you now what to look for. The theme that you're going to hear throughout the rest of tonight is that with higher dietary levels of inclusion of distillers grains, you need forage in that diet, longer forage. And the reason is we need some forage in that diet to stimulate some rumination and to stimulate saliva production. Because it's that saliva that actually buffers the rumen pH. It's got sodium and potassium salts, and we're going to talk about that when I show you the data. But this study looked at, it was what's called a 2x2 factorial. There were 4 diets. They looked at either 20% distillers grains or 40% distillers grains, fed with either corn silage at 15% or chopped hay at 7.5%. The reason they chose that doubling of corn silage versus hay is on a dry matter basis. Corn silage is 50% grain and 50% fiber. So these two diets, while the diet percentages on a dry matter basis were different, it's basically looking at the corn particle size difference between corn silage and chopped hay. And what they found was these steers started at 760 pounds. They all ended around 1365 to 1375. Average daily gain was not different. They all were between 3.46 and 3.48. Pounds of dry matter intake was different. When the cattle were fed hay versus corn silage across these, they went from 22.6 to 20.2 pounds per day intake. The impact of this was, though, there was a difference in feed to gain. it only took 6.06 pounds of feed per pound to gain at 40% versus 20%. And I ran that on these values, and that's 97 pounds less feed to put on that gain. And if this diet was 14 cents a pound, this 40% inclusion versus 20% inclusion with this group of cattle would have been worth $13.58 per head. So what I want you to see is when you're looking at relatively small differences in feed efficiency, what you do is, since that's pounds of feed per pound of gain, you calculate the total pounds of feed that were consumed, and you look at the total pounds of gain to figure out whether that's really economically important. The more important thing was, on forage, if corn silage was fed, it took 6.53 pounds of feed per pound of gain. If hay was fed, 5.8 pounds of feed per pound of gain. That's 396 pounds of feed difference. At 14 cents a pound, that's worth $55. That's pretty significant. Even though they ate less, they were more efficient and they gained the same. There were no differences in back fat. There were no significant differences in hot carcass weight, although 11 pounds is numerically pretty important. There were no differences in ribeye or yield grade or quality grade. This comes down to an efficiency thing. And we're going to talk a lot of the reasons why. But when you do something to alleviate a metabolic stress on an animal, and that additional fiber stimulating more rumination looks to me like it probably alleviated some metabolic stress, which we'll discuss why in another study here.
That corn silage and hay is either or, right?
It was either or. They fed 4 diets. They fed 20% distillers grains with corn silage, 20% distillers grains with hay. They fed 40% distillers grains with that corn silage and 40% distillers grains with hay. And there were not interactions. So what it came out with was, regardless of the level of distillers grains, that was a real effective hay. That's why they broke it out that way.
Then getting on the efficiency, would it, if you would have fed just a little bit of hay in that ration with the corn silage, would that have changed that efficiency much?
We can't extrapolate that. That's the danger of looking at a trial. And that's a really good question, Glenn. The thing is, when you look at one study, you can't extrapolate beyond what they looked at. But what you can do is you can look at a body of work. And sometimes we call that a meta-analysis, where someone has looked at all the research, like those graphs that were a meta-analysis. That meta-analysis that Alfredo Di Costanza did was from about 40 different trials that were published. But I'm going to show you some more stuff later that would make me think yes. I just don't want to say for certain, because I can't. Yeah, Roy.
So, Francis, that was looking at chopped hay. What would be the effect if you did chop hay, if you just fed 7.5 pounds of regular hay?
I wouldn't really highly recommend that. And the reason I wouldn't recommend that is because I don't think long hay has any place at all in a feedlot. There's not a commercial feedlot that feeds long hay, and there's a reason for it. The longer the particle size something is, and at what level? Okay, let's say I only feed a pound per day of long hay, just 5% of the total diet dry matter. Well, even at that level, if I'm feeding long hay, what I'm doing is, over 5 or 6 days, the pH in these ruminants, as you'll see in a minute, is really low. It's in the 5s. The things that cause a low rumen pH are lots of surface area, because bacteria digest by attaching. So think of what a small particle size distillers grains is. And then think I put it in with any kind of processed corn at all. I've got very small particle sizes, so I get a very rapid rate of digestion. So that pH is really low. I'll show you pHs in the 4s. Okay? Fiber digestion doesn't occur well at all below a pH 6. When those cattle are out on grass, or you've got a brood cow eating long stem hay, that pH is going to be around 6.8 to 7. Well, here's why that's important for you. If I say the difference between a pH 7 and a pH 5 is tremendous, a lot of people look at me and go, well, no, not really. One's only a 5 and one's only a 7. But pH is a measurement of the hydrogen ion concentration. It's what's called the negative log of the hydrogen ions. So what that means, if I go from a pH 7, which is neutral, which is where fiber's digested really well in that range, to a pH 6, it's a base 10 log. It means I have 10 times more hydrogen ions at pH 6 than I do 5. So those bacteria that are very pH sensitive, those fiber digesting bacteria, don't function nearly as well at a low pH of 6 as they do at 5. And how does that pH drop? When the bacteria attach to the feed, they digest it. When they digest it, they produce volatile fatty acids. Acids is the thing you have to think of. Acetate, propionate, and butyrate. They're acids. So the faster I get those digested in the rumen, the faster my pH falls. Okay? Those acids are taken up by the blood supply in the rumen wall and go to the liver, where acetate is converted into back fat, or seam fat, or ketone bodies, and propionate's converted to glucose. The bottom line is here that the limiting factor is that liver's ability to convert them fast enough. So those acids build up in the rumen. The bacteria can produce them, in some cases, faster than the liver can convert them. Well, if I go from that pH 7 to a pH 6, and it's 10 times different in hydrogen ion concentration, 10 times more acid producing units, then I move to pH 5, it's 10 times 10. So it's 100 times more hydrogen ions or acid producing ions at a pH 5 than a pH 7. I know that's a really long answer, but you have to understand that small changes in pH numerically are tremendous changes metabolically and physiologically for the animal and from rumen function. Okay, here's why I don't like the long hay now. The reality. That long hay, because that pH is so low, is not going to be digested effectively. It's going to build up what's called a mat layer in that rumen over 4 or 5 days. Digestibility of it's going to be really low. Well, how does that animal get rid of it? They chew their cud. They regurgitate it, they chew it, they re-swallow it. Okay, every time they re-swallow, there's a positive side to that with chopped hay. They get some flow into the rumen. But I don't want a lot of feed washing out, because if you think of the rumen sort of a barrel with a hose coming into the esophagus and another hose going out to the reticulum and on down the digestive tract, if I create too much saliva production, those small particles from the distiller's grains and from a processed grain can flow out. So it's a fine balance. I mean, that's the bottom line, which is why most of this work gets done with chopped hay. I'll show you another alternative here later tonight. So, let's look at sulfur concentrations. NRC says the maximum tolerable limit's 0.4%, but we know that distiller's grains can contain about 0.6 to 1.4%, but there's some variability. There's also something we got to throw in, and that's water. We have to know the sulfate in the water. With high concentrate diets, if we have more than 600 milligrams of sulfate per liter of water, and you do this by a water test, you can have issues with high sulfur concentrations in water. It's actually not as bad if I'm feeding a forage diet. With a forage diet, like if I were feeding brood cows, I could take up to 2,500 milligrams of sulfate per milliliter because my rumen pH is higher. And that sulfate stays in a form that doesn't volatilize, which is really what causes polio in these animals. So here's the problem. We're feeding more distiller's grains. We're feeding more sulfur. And we have to figure out a deal with this. This is a picture of an animal with a sulfate toxicity. They tend to become disoriented. They wander. They salivate a lot. I like to joke that if this were a Holstein, standing over a feed trough would just be normal behavior, because they'll try to do things to get themselves in trouble. So if you're feeding a bunch of Holsteins, you have to look at other things, because they really are curious cattle, and they'll do stuff like this. The problem is, some research done, Glenn, with a meta-analysis looking at many studies, okay, from University of Nebraska, showed that if I've got less than 20% distiller's grains, or either wet or dry, I have a very few percentage, less than 0.1% pulled for this polioencephalomalacia. And we call them brainers because neurologically they're affected. And so If we had less than 0.46% sulfur, we only had 0.14%. If 0.46 to 0.58% sulfur in the diet, 0.38. So it more than doubles, nearly 3 times as more. The problem is, as we go into these real high levels with 60%, if we have more than 0.58% sulfur, their data said you get 6% brainers. These animals largely do not recover. You can't afford that kind of loss with the cost of cattle today, especially. Well, I put together a graph just to give you some kind of an idea of what this would be. And what I assumed was, I looked at dry matter intake, and as a sulfur as a percent of the diet, assuming 20 pounds of consumption of feed. And this is the 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, or 70 are the percent distillers grains inclusion in the diet, and these would be the pounds. At 20 pounds of intake, 10% would be 2 pounds. 20% would be 4 pounds of distillers grains. Okay, we can see that at 0.4% sulfur, I can go really high on distillers grains. I don't ever get into that 0.5 range. My green is totally safe. The yellow is I start to pay attention. The red is I'm worried. And the real dark red, I don't want to touch. And what you see is, because of product variability, a batch of distillers grains that only has 0.6% sulfur, I can easily feed up to 50% of the diet. I'm not real worried. I'm doing some other things, but I can manage that. But if I get 1%, that same 50%, I would expect a lot of polio I would expect to have a high percentage of poles and deads. So the reality of it is, if you're not feeding distillers grains yet, I'm going to recommend that if you're not feeding them, you stay low in that 20 to 25% range or 30% range till you learn how to feed them really well. Any questions on this? Okay. So, we're seeing a lot of increase in feeders in the upper Midwest going to 50% distillers grains. We need to know the sulfur level in byproducts, we need to know the water sulfur, and we need to ask, how do we increase roughage and what would that do? And at this point, I need to take on the thiamine versus the non-thiamine issues. With starch-based diets, polioencephalomalacia, where we call it feedlot polio, is a deficiency of the B vitamin thiamine produced by the rumen bacteria. The rumen bacteria produce all of the B vitamins that the animal needs. You know, if you're working with pigs or chickens, you're doing B vitamin supplementation. If you're working with cattle, we don't need to. Well, how do we get polio, feedlot polio, without distillers grains? We get a breakdown of thiamine, and it comes when we're adapting cattle to a fermented diet or to a higher percentage of grain, and something shifts that rumen from more gram-negative bacteria to gram-positive. The most famous gram-positive bacteria is Streptococcus bovis, the one that we normally consider to be classically the problem in acidosis. Okay? When we get this switch, when there's no thiamine, it inhibits glycolysis and the Krebs cycle, and it causes the animal, you've probably, if you fed cattle for any length of time, had one feedlot polio animal. They're the ones, because thiamine is used in muscle coordination and function, that they drag their hind legs. And then a few hours later, they'll be down on their side. And the last two things that function are the eyelids and the heart. And they eventually, it's like the Energizer bunny running out of energy. They die. Okay. Need you to know that there are nearly every feed company out there is adding thiamine to their feedlot diets. But we need to look at whether that really is backed up by much research or not. Greg Lardy in North Dakota did one study where he found a link with thiamine. Other than that, there have been a lot of studies that show it's not really thiamine. In sulfur-induced PEM, or polioencephalomalacia, the ruminal and blood levels of thiamine are actually adequate. Ruminal pH decreases, and we get what's called a hydrogen sulfide molecule produced. That hydrogen sulfide molecule is actually belched out. Think of how big the nasal passages are on a steer, and they're right above the mouth. And they're always eructating gas. They're always belching. They're still ruminating, and that's being expelled. Okay, where have some of you heard of hydrogen sulfide gas problems before? Have you ever pumped manure pits? You have a hydrogen sulfide meter that you can't go in there. Why? You inhale it. Okay, and when it's inhaled, it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. It's inhaled directly through the nasal passages and can immediately cause damage to the brain. Okay, it causes cell damage in the brain, it causes lung damage. There's a group of us that think really, from some data that we've got, that it's really this hydrogen sulfide gas. So does it induce thiamine deficiency? Well, whether it does or not, sulfate toxicity does all of these others. It reduces copper and selenium absorption. So if you're feeding real high levels, even before they turn into brainers, you have to realize that you're tying up copper, and copper is used in energy metabolism. And you're tying up selenium. Not a cool thing if you've got a bunch of calves that came out of the southeast and are really selenium deficient. You get a reduced feed intake. Animals will probably have excessive saliva. They may look emaciated. You'll get the neurological damage, and they'll do strange things, the walking, and it causes death. So, how does high sulfur cause this PEM? Well, a low rumen pH, as I've talked about pH earlier, is real high in these free hydrogen ions. At a pH of 5.5, about 95% of the sulfide, they're in the form of sulfide go in, they become hydrogen sulfide. Highly fermentable diets, or feedlot diets, cause this drop in pH, which sets up the problem. So we've got to be really, really careful about what we do from a management standpoint to be able to feed higher levels of distillers grains. At this point in time, Rory, I'm going to kill it and take questions before I go over some of the research. Do we have it? Okay, I'm going to talk about some research that we've done over at OERDC. This was Tara Felix's PhD research with Steve Lurch. And what it was is looking at the effects of haylage. And let me say this point in time. At some places during these slides it says hay. It is haylage. It just says that for the way the tables were made. But it is haylage. And monensin, which is rumensin, on performance, mineral status, and carcass characteristics of feedlot cattle. All this data was done with 60% distillers grains diets. So we wanted to look at the impact that rumensin and haylage would have on the mineral status of the animal, performance, and carcass characteristics of the steers. So here's the bottom line. You know, we know that higher levels of distillers grains can depress intake, decrease average daily gains, and have this effect on health of the PEM. And here's what happens. In the rumen, sulfide is reduced to hydrogen sulfide. And hydrogen sulfide, as I said, is eructated when the animal belches. And it bypasses any kind of detoxification. It goes straight from the mouth and is inhaled. And it doesn't need to cross any blood-brain barrier when it's inhaled. So it goes directly to the brain. And as a result, we get polio encephalomalacia, which we call PEM, because no one in their right mind wants to pronounce that too many times. Okay, so the hypothesis was that haylage and monensin would increase average daily gain and dry matter intake, and that their effects would be additive. And thought that monensin would increase trace mineral absorption as measured by circulating copper and liver accumulation of trace minerals. So, as I discussed pH earlier, when rumen pH increases with added forage and decreases with average daily gain, monensin inhibits the acetogenic bacteria which decreases hydrogen ion production. Now here's why this is important. We can't reduce the amount of sulfur that's in the distillers grains, but we can reduce hydrogen ions that are free in the rumen, which would lead to less hydrogen sulfide production, that H2S. And both would suggest that we would decrease the substrates available for the hydrogen sulfide gas. Well, this is where this gets kind of interesting. This comes from Galen Erickson at University of Nebraska. And this is just with corn-based diets. And what it does is it shows the normal pattern of ruminal pH. The blue line is feed intake, so they're fed here. This is when feed's delivered. They eat, it goes down. After feed is delivered, ruminal pH goes down. Now, if you look over on the right side, you see that in normal situations, pH doesn't stay below about a 5.5 on a high grain diet for very long. And we normally consider the time below a pH of 5.5 as kind of classic for subacute acidosis with starch. So this is just our normal pattern. Well, what we did, and I'll explain this, is these are the 4 treatments. The blue line that's represented by no monensin and no haylage in these diets. Look at how long the pH stayed below pH of 5. This is the first time rumen pHs have ever been recorded in the 4s. Okay? Rumen pH of 4 is just unheard of when you're feeding a starch-based diet. And what I'm going to tell you at the end of the story now, this isn't from the classic acidosis that we would see. This is from the amount of sulfur that is still in a sulfuric acid form in the rumen once that distillers grains is solubilized. So we get the lowest pH with no monensin, no haylage. The red line is 30 grams monensin with no hay. The green line is no monensin at all with hay. So in answer to your question, does haylage help? Yeah, it does. But the best is when we put rumensin with the hay. The pH stays the highest. When we look at hydrogen sulfide gas production, those levels that are above 2,000 parts per million hydrogen sulfide, that's about where we start really getting issues, according to the literature, with this PEM. Because above that, there's so much free hydrogen sulfide that you can't really stop a certain percentage of them being inhaled. By far the best at reducing that free hydrogen sulfide was the monensin plus the hay, plus followed by the monensin without the hay. What that tells me is the monensin's really critical here at these high levels so that we don't get as much production of those free hydrogen ions. We followed this up with a study, a feedlot study, where we fed 60% distillers grains. We used 165 Angus cross steers. They were averaged 159 days on feed. We had 24 pens of them. And we looked at these 4 treatments that we used in the lab. The no rumensin, no haylage, 33 milligrams of monensin with no haylage, no monensin with 10% haylage, and 33 milligrams of monensin with 10% haylage. We fed 10% corn silage to all of the cattle, just the way we formulated the diets. And the average dietary sulfur in these diets was 0.5% sulfur. So we were above that 0.4 maximum. This is what I want you to see. The stuff in red is what I think is really interesting. There was a haylage effect. The animals on final body weight, the animals that were fed haylage weighed significantly more than those that were not fed haylage over here. 1188 to 1217. Or I'm sorry, 1157 to 1144. Haylage 1188 to 1217. Average daily gain was actually, when we just looked at monensin, lower with the Monensin versus without, but there was a significant interaction. Monensin fed with Haylage resulted in the highest average daily gain. We see that the Haylage had a positive effect. Dry matter intake, we got a Haylage effect. Those with Haylage ate a little bit more, and they were more efficient. They were about 5% more efficient in their average daily gain. When we look at carcass characteristics, there was a Haylage effect, 728 pounds versus 745 pounds, with or without Haylage. There was also a Haylage effect on loin muscle, longissimus area, 11.9 to 12.3, and it tended to be for quality grade. Here's an important thing. The 400 or 4.8 and 4.75, the 4s were selects. The 5s were low choice. That difference between 0% Haylage and 10% Haylage had a huge impact on quality grade. I think the last choice select spread I saw a couple days ago was $8 a hundredweight. This year it's been as high as 20. So having that Haylage in really had an impact on quality grade. You're selling carcasses by yield and grade. Heavier carcasses that are higher grading with that Haylage is a really important thing. So what are the major points of this research? With 10% Haylage versus without Haylage, dry matter increased 18.9%. Average daily gain increased 9.3%. Feed to gain increased 8.9%. Hot carcass weight increased 39 pounds. Average quality grade was low choice, not high select. There was no change in back fat or yield grade. I think we need to be seriously thinking about having some sort of hay or Haylage in these diets if you move to these higher levels of distillers grains. I still think there's a benefit at lower levels. But what I take away from this is we really need to be looking at both Monensin and high Haylage. When we look at the Haylage and Monensin interaction, without average daily gain, Monensin did not affect average daily gain. With added hay, Monensin increased average daily gain by nearly 5%. So if I'm using these higher levels of distillers grains, I'm using every technology that's available to me. Now, even though I don't like long hay, if that's what you have, it's better from a health standpoint, I think, to feed it than to not. Okay? If you're going to these higher levels, you need something larger than the particle size of corn silage. If you have rotocut bales, and that's what you're doing to break apart, I'm never going to ever recommend anyone put a round bale in a feedlot, in a farmer feeder situation. But I'm going to recommend that they come apart a lot easier, and that if you get a mixer, they break up a lot better. I have nothing against that 5 to 6 inch particle size is what I'm saying. I don't have anything against 1 inch either, because in the rumen, at 10% of the diet, they're both going to stimulate rumination. Okay, they're both going to have an impact on that saliva. So here's my caution for this. While I showed you that data, these trials were conducted with specific mineral formulations. When we look at copper maximum levels, we're looking at 10 parts per million. That's what's recommended. We formulated for these diets, for these series of studies, copper levels of 100 to 200 parts per million. Because I know that at these high levels of distillers grains, that high sulfur ties up copper. So we are higher than what's recommended for these. Okay? I'm not going to recommend that you do that. You're not legally allowed to. Okay? We need to do a lot more research before we recommend more than 40% distillers grains, especially to farmer feeders. Lots of land-grant universities are looking at this. I need to see a lot more data in the published literature, not that is currently being conducted, that has gone through a review process before we can start making recommendations on different copper sources. There's a lot of universities working on things. There's a lot of graduate students doing it until it's in the published literature and has gone through a referee process. And what that basically means is when Luke gets done with his master's degree and we submit his manuscripts to the Journal of Animal Science, they go out to reviewers blindly who review how we're doing the studies and the science behind that and the literature and evaluate our conclusions. And that's a blind process. When we get enough of those done, I'll be more comfortable recommending things. But right now, a lot of that would just be speculations. So, with roughage and distillers grains, increasingly important with higher inclusion levels. Don't miss that. Rumen motility does become an issue, but it's not really rumen papillae. We need to increase that rumen motility. We have to have a microbial population that functions well. So, here's some additional considerations when we're working with these diets. If I look at the phosphorus in co-product feeds, corn gluten feeds about 1.1% phosphorus, distillers grains 0.83, soybean meal 0.71. I really want to point out that American Society of Animal Science, the Federation of Animal Science, and a lot of work by Galen Erickson at the University of Nebraska has been conducted looking at phosphorus levels. And we should never be putting additional phosphorus in feedlot diets. If you are, and you feed distillers grains, you have a much higher chance of urinary calculi. In cattle, it's called water belly. But it's a horrible thing to run into, and you've got a good chance of running into it with more than just a small percentage of your cattle. You can really create a problem. Save the money, take the phosphorus out. And this just shows, Galen did stuff going from 0.14 to 0.34 or even 0.16 to 0.4% phosphorus. There are some feed companies out here that still recommend phosphorus in feedlot diets. None of the recent data backs that up at all. If any of you run into that situation, give me a call. I'll talk to them. Okay, so what it means, no phosphorus supplementation. When you're feeding high levels of distillers grains, the copper level in the supplements needs to be increased to the maximum level that your feed company feels that they can increase it. It's got to take up for all that sulfur. And I'm not going to tell you what those levels are because each feed company out there has its own recommendations and their own levels that they feel comfortable with legally. Okay, but you need to increase the copper levels just so that we know we aren't running into a problem with sulfur, especially in Ohio where we have such high sulfur levels in the water. Okay, before I go on, any questions up to this point in time with the distillers grains? So what I want you to remember, the big things. Haylage or hay and rumensin both help. Increasing copper helps. Okay? The other thing is, let's talk thiamine for a second. Every feed company out there is adding thiamine to their feedlot minerals practically. There's very little science behind it. There's a lot of marketing behind it. And here's what I mean by marketing. When a feed company that doesn't have thiamine, the mineral, drives down the lane, and the next feed salesperson drives in the lane and says, well, no wonder your cattle didn't grade well. You didn't have thiamine. There's not much more than that to it right now. Everyone's doing it because everyone's doing it. And it's got much more to do with sales. But what I'm telling you is, don't be conned into thinking just because you're feeding a mineral with thiamine that all of this stuff is meaningless. Because the vast majority of the data that's out there shows this is what's going on, not thiamine. That's by marketers. Okay, the other thing you need to keep in mind, and we ran into this a couple of years ago, aflatoxins are not destroyed during the ethanol process. So those distillers grains, if corn has a level of distillers grain, if corn has an aflatoxin level, your distillers grains are likely to have an aflatoxin level 3 to 3.5 times that, because you're taking away all of the starch and concentrating everything else. So the aflatoxin levels are a lot higher. So quite frankly, if you've been going along and doing just fine with distillers grains, and you get into a situation where you've got some deaths that you just can't explain, send a sample of the feed away and test for aflatoxins and mycotoxins, because you might have a bad batch. Okay, and that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Aflatoxin levels that are normal are 300 parts per billion for finishing cattle. A few years ago, we saw some aflatoxin levels that were significantly higher than that. And finally, tonight, I'm going to cover some stuff on just some recent research that we've been doing down at Bell Valley, looking at different byproducts for cattle being fed on forages. Because a lot of you in this room are looking for ways to cheapen up gains. And backgrounding cattle on grass or hay is going to become more popular. I think I really see us going back with these high prices. If you can put some weight on grass, it makes a lot of sense. Now we have 3 feeds here that a lot of people use and have access to: soy hulls, corn gluten feed, or distillers grains. The most overpriced supplement we have, feed supplement we have for putting gain on cattle, are soy hulls. But a lot of people around here like them because they've been sold that they don't limit fiber digestibility. Well, they're high in cellulose, they're low in fat, they're relatively low in protein, or 12 or 13% protein. They don't have anything in my mind that's going to boost gain. Now, corn gluten feed, as we mentioned earlier, provides rumen ammonia. So if I'm feeding a forage that is low in protein, supplementing corn gluten feed should boost the digestibility of that feed by providing more ammonia for the bacteria and may result in more gain. And distillers grains, while they have 2/3 of the protein from bypass protein, for a gain standpoint, it's high in energy and high in protein total. So there may be enough protein in there to get more gain. Well, we're doing a study, and these are preliminary. I don't have the final gain data, but these are the preliminary data 56 days in, where we just looked at these 3 feeds with steers, and these were fed at about 1% of body weight with free access to hay. Pelleted soy hulls, those calves are gaining 1.33 pounds per day. The corn gluten feed 154 and the distillers grains 151. No difference between the corn gluten or distillers with this, but they're both higher than the soy hulls. So what I'm letting you know is, if you're looking for a supplement for grass, especially in confinement, okay, if you're looking at round bales and you're trying to do either corn gluten feed or distillers, looks to me a lot better choice than soy hulls. I don't want to see you wasting your money on soy hulls. That's all I have prepared for tonight. If you've got any questions, I'll be glad to take them. Yes?
With that last slide you just showed, what about barley?
Barley would be higher in energy. You'd get the same kind of result that you would if you supplemented corn. Okay, basically you would see something probably pretty similar to the distillers grains. You know, at only 1% of body weight, on a dry matter basis, when you're feeding something like this at 1%, the real diet that they're eating works out to be probably something like 60% forage and 40% grain on a dry matter basis. You'd see something similar to the distillers grains, maybe a tick higher, maybe 1/10 or 2/10 higher. You'd definitely be providing more energy. Yes?
When DDGs first started up, everybody was all nutted up about the antibiotics in it, and I haven't heard anything said about that. Has that issue gone away?
Yeah. As we have fed higher, yes, it has to a degree. I haven't heard what USDA has ever done with that. At one point in time, they were going to look into it. My feeling on that is, until someone brings it up, there is no industry standard or worry about it. I think as people have fed higher levels, people have been more concerned about all of the other problems that are occurring with them, and also the other benefits that are occurring. The one thing you need to remember, I said early on, if you've got manure from your feedlots with higher levels of DDGs, get it sampled. It's probably got a lot higher value of manure than anything that you had when you switched from corn to the Distillers grains. It's definitely going to have more phosphorus. It's definitely going to have more protein, more nitrogen. Anything else? Yes.
Does the 0.4% sulfur from any sulfur source provide the same kind of problems?
It's the more reactive forms. Now we've got high sulfur levels in water, and there's some tables of all the different forms of sulfur. So the answer is no. It depends on what form the sulfur is in.
Is anything being done with the distillers grains to try to reduce the amount of sulfur?
Not a thing. Not really. And the reality of it is, this is an energy industry, and we buy the byproduct. Any other acid would work. Hydrochloric acid would work. Nitric acid would work. But they're both much more expensive. I mean, sulfuric acid is the cheapest acid, and it's highly effective. You know, it's what we use in a lab to break proteins apart. So when they use sulfuric acid, it does a phenomenal job of sterilizing the system. So the reality of it is no. And that's a cost thing.
Is there any difference in the price of the sources there versus the sulfur content?
No, not really. I've been to I've been at some conferences where the industry claims that it's a very stable level. But the reality of it is, it's not. It's batch to batch variation. And if you want a low sulfur distillers grains, quite frankly, the whiskey distilleries have the lowest sulfur distillers grains, but we're so far from any of them that that we don't have access. I know in southern Ohio and Kentucky, southern Indiana, those come at a premium because you can feed higher levels just due to the low sulfur levels in them.
When you talk about, we do have the new generation DDGs.
Yes.
Now, they told me Marion's supposed to switch to those in June or July. They're talking about 9% fat, 7%, and 4% fat.
And this, I'm glad you brought that up, because what we have right now classically is the new generation. When these plants are talking about, it's really the next generation. It's really Generation Xers, okay? Because that is where you're removing the oil. And when you remove the oil, like Poet is doing, that's really, when you get down to that 5%,